This video is brought to you by Skillshare. Stay tuned till the end of the video or click on the link in the description for a free 2-month trial. On this channel, I've covered some of the most significant success stories in the Japanese gaming industry. The sensational rags to riches saga of Final Fantasy, Yasunori Mitsuda's quest for prominence while working on Chrono Trigger, whereas perfectionism nearly destroyed his health, and Tetsuya Takahashi's passion and hunger to tell his own stories, leading to the expressly profound Xenogears. In each of these cases, brilliant men worked outrageously long hours and suffered through staggering pressure, but overcame it all to deliver some of the best gaming experiences of all time. Each of them also went on to enjoy prestigious careers in the industry and were celebrated for their timeless contributions to the genre. Today's story won't have such a happy ending. Today, we'll be looking at a neglected and forgotten development studio called Quintet, who created some of the greatest RPGs on the Super Nintendo. You've likely heard of many of their games: ActRaiser, Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia. These are all remembered fondly by those who had the pleasure of playing them back in those days. Though the developers at Quintet were just as passionate and talented as those we know so well from Square, they tragically never achieved the renown or success they deserved. Terranigma, released in October of 1995 in Japan and December of 1996 in PAL territories, combined all the hallmarks of Quintet's unique approach and philosophy, iterating on old ideas and executing on new ones with brilliance, delivering an unquestionable masterpiece. It was, for all intents and purposes, the company's swan song, and shines bright as Tomoyoshi Miyazaki's masterwork. When asked about the central theme of Terranigma, Miyazaki, the director and co-founder at Quintet, answered by saying, "In Terranigma, destruction and creation are linked together. To give an example of what I mean, your enemies in Terranigma are not simplistic bad guys, and depending on how you defeat them, the environment of the game will evolve accordingly." Also, another big theme for Terranigma is duality, or the idea that opposites are inextricably linked together as one. Destruction and creation would be a prime example of that. Quintet had a unique approach to violence in their games. While combat was always a staple feature, the way they portrayed violence was more reflective and thoughtful than their contemporaries. Terranigma was no different, incorporating this creation theme Quintet had already become known for, while artfully crafting this unshakable spirit, centered on an incredibly strong sense of duality. There's no better way to sum up my impressions of the game than with that word: duality. There's such a strong contrast, such a powerful dual nature to the game's presentation that it left me feeling equal parts joyful and devastated when the ending credits rolled. Never in my 25+ years of gaming have I found one that so perfectly balances humorous and lovable characters with deeply felt grief, heartbreak, and melancholy. Miyazaki described the framework for this spirit of Terranigma by saying, "In the course of making our previous games, I started to think about what the actions of humans would look like from a non-human viewpoint. The heart of Terranigma's story lies in the perspective of the Earth and how it views human activity." I've played Terranigma twice now, and the more I think about it, the more difficult it becomes to describe the experience. While RPGs like Xenogears are centered on cerebral, academic ideas that lend themselves to secular discourse, Terranigma communicates its themes through a feeling, through abstraction that speaks to the emotions rather than to the intellect. The resurrection sequences are the best examples of this. At certain points of the game, after completing dungeons, these elaborate, beautiful landscapes expand across the player's purview, and Terranigma's soul exists somewhere in the feeling generated by these murals and the contemplative melodies that accompany them. These scenes alone took up 8 megabytes of the cart's total 32 megabyte storage, but when you understand how critical they are to the game's message, you begin to understand why Quintet was willing to allocate so much precious memory. The developers acknowledged this in interviews leading up to the game's release. We felt it was justified because those are the scenes which are most deeply connected to the concept and themes. We used some incredible technology to bring them to life. Technology that is actually used in creating TV weather broadcasts. We used the same development software that was used by the English company Rare when they were making Donkey Kong Country. It's actually quite hard to make realistic animations with the Super Famicom hardware, and memory is another tough spot. But we really wanted to have a chance, even just once, to try out this development software, as well as fractals and other new technologies. I think there's a widespread sentiment among gamers that graphics don't make a game. I feel like players tend to think that while amazing graphics are a nice cherry on top, so to speak, that mechanics and the user experience always trump the cosmetic mask through which those things are presented. While I don't disagree with that in a general sense, for games like Terranigma, which present their themes through abstract visual storytelling, the graphics are an enormous consideration, and in this case were painstakingly reiterated again and again until they were exactly right. We've really worked hard on the graphics quality for Terranigma. How many times did we redo the graphics to get them just right? I've lost count. And the final result would often turn out completely different from what we started with. As the title Tenchi Suzu implies, I really want players to enjoy the resurrection scenes, because I want them to think about the meaning of the idea that we create our own world. We put a lot of effort into the graphics for the scenes where the continents are resurrected. I have no idea how many times we remade them. In fact, Kamui Fujiwara, who served as art director and character designer, felt such a strong connection to the way Terranigma's themes were being visually represented that he couldn't help but get more involved in the project. Originally, he was brought on as an independent contractor to draw the characters, but he couldn't bring himself to stop there. At first, I was only designing the human characters and the boss monsters, but as I was drawing some of the event scene sketches, I would get ideas for things to add to the game, like wouldn't it be cool if this happened here or if this moved like that, etc. For example, with the Tower of Trials, they told me they wanted some way to visually convey the influence the towers have on the light side surface world. I'm really satisfied with the work we did. Because they let me be a part of the process instead of just treating me like a contractor who just completes the work he's given, I think it turned out very well. That dualistic structure of the game, where what you do in one world affects the other, was extremely interesting to me. As a creator, the world had a certain openness to it that stimulated my imagination. I mean, I liked it so much, I wish I had been more involved with it from the very beginning. As I read Fujiwara's interview, it struck me how his struggle to communicate the game's sentiments with his art sort of mirrored the ideas I was discovering in the story itself. The abstract concepts of inspiration and creation, as well as the iteration that is a mandatory byproduct of certain ideas not working at all, really struck me as profound. There's a sense of loss that comes from abandoning one train of thought for another, but a triumph that comes from finally finding the right idea that perfectly suits the situation and fits so efficiently into the larger picture. When you're doing character design, you have to draw the characters in a variety of poses for the animation patterns, and as I did that work, I discovered things I really wanted to see included in the game. Basically, I fell down the rabbit hole of my own accord. Compared with other characters, I had to redraw Ark over and over, and he ended up being very different from how I originally drew him. Of course, the more you struggle with something, the more memorable it is. On the other hand, going that deep made the actual design work itself very easy. When drawing the character concept art, if an idea would pop into my head for an event scene or dungeon, trap, or feature, I'd just plunge right in and start drawing it. Personally, I was blown away by the animation quality displayed here. Since Terranigma is an action RPG where you control a single character, the developers were able to allocate a lot of resources into animating Ark, the main character of the story. From his walk and run cycle to his numerous battle animations, Ark is without question one of the most intricately animated characters in a Super Nintendo RPG. 3 of my favorites are his climbing animation, where he sort of swings his legs in a playful, childlike manner, the level up animation, where he takes a wide power stance as the momentum from his power increase blows back his hair and clothes, and this animation, where he jumps and squeezes into a magical box that serves as the game's menu. These are all small details, but they're critical in establishing the sense of duality that was at the center of the creator's intention, and is so resonant throughout the entire game. Ark is this mischievous, blunt, but good-natured boy who unwittingly takes up a hollowed quest that leads to so much beauty and sadness. I love that we don't only get to see that in how he speaks with the other characters in the story, but also in how he moves. His animations bleed personality and help tell us more about who the character is. It's brilliant. One thing I found very interesting about some of the philosophy behind Terranigma's scenario writing was the way the developers spoke about choice and consequence. In one respect, it's clear that they wanted the player to feel like the choices they made had an impact on the world, but I didn't really remember any pivotal dialogue options of that nature appearing while I played. As I continued reading, though, I started to understand where they were coming from. Reiko Takabayashi, the scenario writer for the game, described it this way. In writing the scenarios, I always had that duality foremost in my mind. I wanted players to ask themselves, for example, if it's really right to develop this town when it will destroy the natural habitat of these birds, etc. This way, the player is always complicit in the outcome, whatever they choose. If you don't want to destroy nature, then you have to face the consequence of an underdeveloped city, and so forth. At first, I was a bit confused by that statement. While I remembered that developing towns was a significant side feature of the game, I didn't remember any sort of explicit scene that showed how doing so harmed the natural habitat of animals. When I read the following quotes, however, the picture started to become more clear in my mind. Good and evil are two sides of the same coin. I hope players enjoy seeing the response to their actions after deciding for themselves what is right and wrong in a given situation. We thought about adding some consequences to the player's decisions, but we came to the conclusion that we, the developers, didn't want to be the ones to express that. The option that is chosen will depend on the player. The story ends, but as far as what happens after, perhaps Ark's future will change depending on which option was chosen. Again, with a game so centered on emotional communication, it's hard to put into words exactly why I feel this works, but I can say resolutely that I believe it does. With so many of the game's messages given through moments of reflection and emotional resonance, it makes sense to me that the developers wanted to avoid any kind of direct, verbal exchange through the dialogue. Instead of lecturing the player on the morality of these choices, they instead wanted to guide their audience into the emotional duality that sparks a question in the player's mind, that raises a conflict, but doesn't attempt to give an answer to what you should do. This allows the player to wrestle with the ideas inwardly and builds a powerful connection to the planet, its life, and its conflicting feelings about what's happening on its face. This theme and its deliberate and carefully considered presentation are both tactful and deeply profound, and left a lasting impression on me as the credits rolled, nearly moving me to tears. Of course, much of this has to do with the brilliant soundtrack, which captures the concept of duality as perfectly as anything I've listened to. I'm definitely a sucker for music which contains undertones of both melancholy and hope, that can somehow capture those two emotions simultaneously. This is the kind of feeling I get from the main theme of Final Fantasy VII, or Fisherman's Horizon in Final Fantasy VIII. Both pieces have this sense of contrast that explores the hopes of the characters while also being aware of all the hardship they've suffered. It's this kind of playing with two emotions at once that is crucial to building the tone and atmosphere that I like best in the fiction I consume, and Terranigma is filled with music like this. Composer Masanori Hikichi described this in the liner notes for the soundtrack by saying, "Terranigma was a game created around a single theme. Expressing that in music proved to be quite difficult. The motif of the opening title track embodies designer-director Tomoyoshi Miyazaki's ideas, and much of Terranigma's music is derived from that motif. It guides the player into the world of Terranigma, sometimes gentle and encompassing like the heroine Ellie, yet sometimes also harsh like the destiny Ark finds himself at the mercy of. While you listen to this CD, try thinking about what the developers wanted to express. I know our feelings will reach you." I've spoken at length about the power a great soundtrack can have on a player's experience. How music can be even more effective at communicating emotion than language. There's an instinct, an intuition we have with music that is impossible to describe. And with the more abstract method the developers chose to deliver their themes to the player, much of that meaning is invariably carried by the soundtrack, and in this case is undeniably effective. It probably sounds like a cliche at this point coming from me to heap praise on the soundtrack of a 90s era JRPG, when so many of them had beautiful, timeless melodies that worked magic in millions of hearts around the world. But it doesn't make it any less true that Terranigma is right up there with some of the best music ever written for video games. It's just so sentimental, triumphant, and nostalgic all at once, containing such a pleasant combination of sound patches that makes perfect use of all of the strengths of the SNES. It's also masterfully mixed, with melodies that cut through and shine while the accompaniment bolsters those phrases and gives them strength. Another observation that rang true to me, made by one of my viewers, Chris Ewan, is that the music also reinforces a sense of isolation amidst all these beautiful creations springing up around you. In a sense, it feels like you're never really part of the world you're bringing to life, adding all the more to that twofold motif found so prominently throughout the entire game. In a word, it's poignant. Heartrending in the sense that it takes you by two emotions at once and tears you in opposite directions. And I love it for that. That's not to say that it's all somber and joyless. There's also a ton of well-paced silliness that brings strong balance to the overall adventure. I don't have a wild animal like a lion here. First thing the dude says, I'll make this clear right now. I don't have a wild animal like a lion here, alright? Much of this is actually achieved through the writing itself, and speaks so strongly to those of us who were kids during that time. There's a cultural awareness embodied in the way characters talk, in the way they dress, that immediately brings images of the fashion and music of my childhood to my memory. There's one character in particular, Peril, whom I insisted on calling 90s Kid in my playthrough, that perfectly captures what I'm talking about. The character theme, his backwards hat, baggy clothes, skateboarding skills, and overall attitude embodies the image of who all my friends and I aspired to be. It's clear that this character is the direct archetype for the audience Quintet was trying to speak to with this game, and they really pulled it off well. That's totally a 90s Kid right there.
Only 90s kids would understand.
I know, seriously. Only a 90s kid would know that that's a 90s kid.
Things begin to get a little more serious.
Oh, fetch! It's 90s Kid! Oh, 90s Kid, yes! 90s Kid? 90s Kid's a beast. Dude, 90s Kid, talk to me. One of the most amusing features of Terranigma is its correspondence with real-world locations. In Ark's quest to revive the planet, you'll explore cultures and geography that match our own history, albeit loosely, and this is done in a really clever and charming way. It seems this was inspired by Miyazaki's fondness for traveling, which he described by saying, "I love traveling, and often use a world atlas to get ideas. I look at places on the map and get inspiration for different scenes and events." This can be seen clearly in the Continental Resurrection sequences, where familiar landmasses are restored on an atlas-like map screen. I found it both fun and endearing to navigate through these well-crafted environments, and loved seeing how they evolved over time into the modern age. At the center of Terranigma's core experience is its action combat, which is simple but also tight and fluid. It's not strictly an action game, carrying many of the hallmarks of the turn-based RPGs it's clearly inspired by, but the emphasis here is on giving the player complete freedom of movement. Miyazaki described the intention behind this in an interview where he said the following: "For Terranigma, I feel it's more of an RPG action game than an action RPG game. I actually wrote that in the initial planning document. I mean, you control the character directly, so in that sense it's a typical action RPG, but we also spent a lot of time trying to come up with gameplay elements that would reflect the joy of the turn-based RPG experience too. Enemies will make combo attacks on you. One will try to immobilize you so the other can attack, for instance. Turn-based RPGs use text to easily explain a fight situation like that, but it's a bit more difficult for action RPGs, I think. I really like what we managed to pull off with the messages being displayed in real time, though. While there's not a lot to talk about in terms of combat mechanics, I do like how your attacks are context sensitive. If you stand still and press the attack button, you'll do a single stab, which serves as this game's standard attack. But if you stand still and rapidly press the attack button, you'll get this fast flurry of stabs called a rushing attack. If you jump an attack, you'll do this front-flipping slice as you descend, called the spinner. Whereas if you run an attack, you'll do a diving thrust, known as a slicer. My favorite attack, and perhaps the most commonly useful, is the slider, a fast, descending stab from high in the air with lots of momentum, which is executed by running, jumping, then attacking. It's easily the most powerful move, but you'll need to be careful around ledges, because you'll end up falling a lot. There's also a shield, which can block projectiles, but doesn't work against melee attacks, which is most often put to use against the game's impressive gambit of large bosses. The purpose of all these different techniques is to give the player some variety by mixing up which ones will be most effective against the game's various enemies. And to an extent this is true, where certain moves really are better suited than others for specific situations, but for the most part, the slider is your best option. There isn't a robust magic system in this game, especially if you were to compare it to something like Secret of Mana or Seiken Densetsu 3, but there are an assortment of one-time use magical rings you can buy and put to good use in the right situation. I ignored them for the most part, especially since sometimes even a single level up can give you an overpowering advantage, but they are there. Defeated enemies will often drop gems that you use to purchase these rings as well as the standard restorative items in shops. You'll also need Magirocks for the magical items, which you can find throughout the game's environments. Once you use a magical ring, it'll transform back into a Magirock and can be used again for a future purchase. Inventory management is handled in a really unique way here that I found charming, but I could see how some players found it slow and cumbersome. Like I mentioned earlier, when pressing select, Ark will dive into his magical box where all his items, weapons, and equipment are stored, and you navigate between different rooms inside of the box to make your selections and customize. The idea isn't dissimilar to how menus were managed in Fable 3, where you physically navigated through rooms to select your equipment. And while I understand that this is much slower and less efficient than traditional menus, there's something about the idea that is really appealing to me. I liked its implementation here, and would often just go back and forth to watch Ark's hilarious squeezing animation as he enters the box. As was alluded to earlier, Town Expansion serves as Terranigma's side content, where you can do side quests for NPCs that lead to the growth of many of the game's cities. These changes are mostly cosmetic, but there are some rewards offered upon completing them, like weapons and armor becoming available in shops, and attitude changes among the characters found in those locations. It's a fun thing to do on the side, but is by no means necessary to fully enjoy the game. While having a game's most powerful weapons and abilities tied to the side quests as rewards is typically what I prefer, I think in this case the game is paced just right, and seeing the expansion of the cities, when considering the game's creation theme, is a reward in and of itself that works for me. There's no other way to describe Terranigma than to say it's a masterpiece. Quintet took everything they learned through their previous years of development experience and crafted their magnum opus, weaving incredibly profound themes into an RPG made for the blunt and plain-spoken 90s kid. Its subtlety is matchless, its style an encapsulation of an age now past, and its tone perfectly balanced between genuine fun and somber, contemplative platitudes. This makes it all the more tragic that it was essentially the last game the company would ever make, especially when considering all the talent and potential that could have been realized. ActRaiser, Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, Robotrek. It's been a wild ride for us at Quintet, developing for the Super Famicom for these last 6 years. Terranigma is the culmination of all of our efforts and expertise. We hope it stands as our defining work. In any event, we poured our all into it. We're pretty damn burned out now. It kills me to read something like that, knowing the passion and effort that was poured into Terranigma, and to see that Quintet never achieved the success they clearly deserved. Right before the English localization was completed, Enix's North American branch was closed, and so it was never brought to America, where it certainly would have seen a boost in sales. Because of that, Enix and Quintet parted ways, and while some of the developers went on to work on other games under a new development studio, they were never able to recapture the raw creative spark that defined Quintet. Alas, the story leaves us with a bittersweet feeling, and in truth, there's no better word to describe the duality of tone encompassed in Terranigma. In fact, bittersweet may be the only word that can so accurately and simply describe the experience. This game made me laugh, it gave me rushes of nostalgia for the time of my childhood, it was exciting and fun to play, very well designed. But it also left me misty-eyed as the credits rolled, generating a deep sense of sadness and finality that were difficult to shake. It's a game that leaves a lasting impression and stands as one of my favorites of all time. While there may not be many who have recognized the efforts of the brilliant developers at Quintet, I want to give them my recognition now and thank them for such a remarkably crafted work of art. If you haven't played Terranigma, I could not recommend it more. This video was brought to you by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes in design, business, technology, and more. Premium memberships give you unlimited access to high-quality classes from experts working in their fields, so you can improve your skills, unlock new opportunities, and do the work you love. Skillshare is also more affordable than most learning platforms out there. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month. I, for one, am very interested in creative writing, and they have several courses here that help you expand your understanding and improve as a writer. If you click on the link that I have in the description below, you can get a free 2-month trial, but this will only be available for the first 500 people who click. So, if you're interested, click on that link in the description or visit the URL that I have displayed here on the screen. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.